Talk on the setup of Drupal 8 on the Azure App Service. I am Patrick Thurmond, your host. Who am I? I'm a Drupal developer. I have a lot of different experience in the computer industry. I actually started out learning computer networks and how to build computer networks, build computers, fix computers. I did years of computer repair, laptop projector. I did tech support for years, and I used to hate programming, oddly enough. But something happened in college, and during a class on software development, I got very competitive when somebody tried to steal my code and compete against me. And suddenly I fell in love. I taught myself PHP in that semester, actually, and about stateless development, about how to use sessions, and a lot of different things, and web development in general, in 3 months, basically. So that was kind of intense. I won the class project, so that was awesome, and got me into programming. I finally found I actually liked programming for the first time. I am also one of the organizers of this event, Drupal Flyover Camp. I've got a fancy LinkedIn profile. I have a very seldom used Drupal.org profile, even though I'm still very active in Drupal, as I do it every day, and a GitHub account where I will be posting these slides. And I also work for VML YNR. We merged with YNR last year, and so now we have a lot more letters and a lot more of a mouthful to say. Okay, what is Azure? Azure is Microsoft's answer to AWS and Google Cloud. Azure has a lot of the same functionality. You have your own virtual machines you can set up. You have something called app services, which we will be focusing on today, databases, and a bunch of different other tools. They do have some free tiers that you can set up and play with for 30 days. And then they have a lot of other tools you can play with, lots of stuff on learning it, and supposedly over half of their virtual machines are now running Linux. Okay, so what got me to doing this talk? A few months ago, I was given a client that was running their Drupal website on Azure. It was really slow, and it had deployments that were failing left and right. It was problematic and kind of a mess. Now, I did not get permission from the client in order to talk specifically about them, so I am not going to mention their name, and you'll see stuff blurred out in some of these slides. So what was going on, they had the failing deploys, and it was running on a Windows app service instead of a Linux one, having very strange errors, and it would vary each time you deploy. So if you hit redeploy, it might be different each time, which is just odd. They had very limited documentation, and Azure has something called Kudu, which is their deployment management tool. I can't exactly remember what it's called. It has its own console tool and lots of documentation, but it's focused more around a very legacy Windows setup, even though the installer for the console is installed via NPM. So what we ended up deciding to do is making a Linux service and give it more juice. Now, what I mean by that is their stage server was running on the free tier of Azure, which is part of the problem of their performance. So I went about trying to switch them over to the Linux app service on Azure, upgrading their service plan, fix their build and deploy process, and for the first time ever, document everything for them, because they had no documentation whatsoever. The first step in this is I had to create a new Git repo for them. Their old Git repo was hosted by them. It was about 2 gigs in size, and it kept failing on the cloning process because it was so big and their server was so underpowered. It drove me nuts, and it made it half impossible for me to do anything. So after I finally get them to temporarily up the specs on their server enough to clone it, I then set them up on a free Bitbucket account. And that's what you're seeing here is a screenshot of that account right here. So set that up. end up setting up 2 different branches for them to operate on. Master, which will go to stage, and production. So what that allows us to do is still do our main workflow development on master off of our ancillary branches. I was the only developer at the time working on this project. It has since been handed off to a third-party agency. So that's where you're seeing these 2 extra branches popping up in here. And then production, so we know what's in production at all times. It is set up to deploy automatically based on the branch you're pushing to. Alright, so in order to set up your Azure App Service, obviously you have to sign up for an account. I'm not going to take us through those slides. It allows you to do, again, 30 days, and $200 worth of free services before they start trying to bill you. But the process is simple. This is the dashboard that they have for Azure. If you just go to portal.azure.com, it'll load it up. It's compatible with single sign-ons. You can use your GitHub account to connect to it, which is what I did with mine. You can also connect it to your company's private single sign-on as well. So just go in there, you click on Create a Resource in the upper left-hand corner, and then that kicks off the next few steps. So the short answer is we create the app service, we create the database, connect the Git Repo, and set up your build and deploy. So to create the app service plan, it's pretty straightforward. Go in there, type in app service plan, and click on that. Fill it out. You are actually required to use resource groups, as you can see on that second line. It's best to go ahead and set up a resource group for, I would say, each environment. But you could just set one up for your whole setup if you'd like. It helps you segment out your billing, but it also helps you kind of cluster things together so you know what each thing is for. You will have to attach every single one of your resources to a resource group, so that part's important. Naming conventions, it uses standard machine naming, no spaces, there's only a limited number of special characters, and then you can select Linux or Windows for the operating system type. It does not let you specify a version. It does not let you specify a flavor of Linux, any of that. It's just a generic Linux, whatever that means for them. All right, and then you can specify the part of the world that it sits in, the location, and then the actual size and the product number for that plan size. The next thing you got to do, and this is the primary part, is the web app. Now the web app needs the app service plan. I'm not sure why they couldn't combine them together, but it uses the app service plan to know part of what it needs in order to set itself up. So on the left here, you'll see I named the web app. I said whether I wanted to use have it publish code or a Docker image. You can select your runtime stack, and that can be anything from .NET to 5 or 6 versions of PHP to Python, Node, a bunch of different options in there. They've actually expanded it from the classic one. The classic one had probably about half as many options, but they've recently added a bunch. And then you double check your settings, which is what you're seeing on the right here, all the stuff that it's going to be using. And then you got to create your database. They have something called Azure Database for MySQL. It's basically a MySQL clone that runs a virtualized version of MySQL. Same setup as the other resources. Type the name in. It'll bring up a description box like you see on the left here. Hit create. And then on the right, fill in your information, fill in your username, your password. It does enforce password restrictions, and then you can set your MySQL version as well as, they call it the pricing tier, but it's basically how much juice it gives you. You probably don't need a whole lot for Drupal. The database doesn't have to be super screaming fast. So I kept it down on a 1 core. The default's to I think a 2 core and 50 or 100 gig pricing tier. Next up you need to set up your deployments. So once you get your web app set up, you need to go into your actual web app itself, and you'll see an option on the left, and you'll see the screenshot on the upper right on my screen, but you'll see something called the Deployment Center. So when you click on that, you'll see a dashboard when you first come in here. And they give you a couple different options. You can have it pull from an FTP, an Azure Repo, GitHub, a local Git. In my case, I selected Bitbucket. So you authorize it for that, and then you'll select the repository, the team, the repository, and then the branch on Bitbucket. And once you do that, it does its standard verification, and you are good to go on that. Next up is you need to be able to set up your deployment script. Now the deployment script is using Kudu, like I mentioned before. I didn't have a ton of time to delve too far into Kudu, but it installs via npm, and then when you run your setup for Kudu, you can specify what kind of application you are building. Now, what I ended up doing is I started off by having it generate a deploy.sh script by specifying the PHP option. However, I also ran this again to generate a separate script for Node, since we wanted to do compilations for the theme layer. And then I just combined the elements that were different between the two, so that it had the bits that needed for Node and the bits needed for PHP. And as you can see, I've linked here the documentation they have. They've been putting everything on GitHub, which is actually really cool. Microsoft has come a long way in the open source world, and they will give you lots of details on that. My slides will be up on GitHub later on, so you won't have to hand jam all that in. After we got all this stuff set up, we had more setup issues, of course. So we ran into a couple of different problems. We had Azure fights you like heck when it comes to where it serves your project from. It expects the base of your Git repository to be where it serves everything from. And when you're running the Windows app service, you can configure it to point to a subdirectory instead. But with the Linux app service, it wouldn't let me do it. I tried a bunch of different commands. I tried doing some symlinking, and there's a huge variety of things within the Azure App Service. And one of the problems you run into is, because this is an app service and not a virtual machine, after I think an hour or two of inactivity, they actually spin it down, and it loses anything that is outside of the repository directory. So it saves any custom files, like any config files that you might have in the directory it deploys to. But beyond that, if you go to like the profile home, you CD into that, it won't let you save any custom scripts or any kind of custom configuration outside of it. It would not let me modify Apache to point to something different. It would not allow me to configure really much at all. I was very disappointed with Microsoft on this. Now, I did see other options, which I'll discuss later on, that might be possible, but I didn't have time to delve into it. We had a limited number of hours on this project, so I had to just keep going with what I could find. Alright, and the other issue I had was it would generate some permissions issues when deploying, due to it automatically moving around. So they're changing some permissions on a few files. And then the version of Node and npm, not num, I have no idea what happened there, are severely outdated on it. We're talking about like npm less than version 1 or something like that. It was really weird to see that too. So there's a couple things we had to fix. The first thing was to fix that serve from directory. We couldn't do that. This was just not going to happen. So I created a htaccess file in the root directory of my repository. With this configuration here, we go into the mod redirect directive, make sure rewrite it sets on, and then redirect everything to the doc root directory. That way, it immediately tells all the requests, oh no, we need to look in there instead. The next thing you got to do is in the htaccess in doc root, there is a condition that is commented out called rewrite base. And so uncomment it out and then change it to rewrite base / doc root. And that will say, hey, the current path that we're in, this is actually the base. Everything's going to pretend that we're starting here, and we'll be happy. The very last thing I had to do was I had to modify my settings.php file to expect index.php to be in a subdirectory, despite the fact that we are pretending to be serving from that subdirectory. And so that's what this little bit of PHP is here. All right. And then I had some permissions issues. These are some minor ones that actually may have been more related to some kind of Drupal operations, but it was changing services YML, settings.php, and settings.local.php to some, I can't remember, it was like 744 or something. So what I did is at the beginning of our deployment process, I switched the directory over to the site's default directory, and then changed the chmod on those files, changed them to fully permissive, and then ran the deployment part of the deploy.sh, where it goes and copies the files. See, what it does is it actually copies the files to a different directory on the app service temporarily, and then it moves it over to the final destination directory that it serves everything from. And so what this does is, before it does that copy over, it changes those permissions, and then once it's done, it changes them to the appropriate permissions, 555. Next thing is to do your work and your deployment. So the just basic workflow, whatever workflow you need to do locally, you do your development, you do your commits, and any changes you need to make. I found, because I didn't have time to figure out the node and npm issues, which it did look like that was resolvable, just didn't have time to deal with that at the time, that I went ahead and compiled the theme assets locally, but I did have the deploy script run the composer install to pull in the vendor directory. You push to that branch for the environment, or do your PRs up to it, whether it be master or production, and it automatically detects it and starts the deploy process. And so on the left here, you'll see how it will output. It'll have it only lists successes. So if you have a series of failures, it'll just replace the last failure with the most recent failure, which is kind of frustrating when you're trying to go back in the history and figure out what's going on. But it'll run. Right, it shows you the outputs. So if you click on the actual instance of success or failure, it'll show you all the command line outputs. And if you want to see specifically your deploy script, you'll go into this line where it says running deploy command and hit show logs, and that will show you the log output from that. I do have further screenshots of all this stuff inside of that Git repository of every step in the way. I just didn't feel it was relevant to put in the slides. Once you get that done, you will finally have a good deployment on the site. Now, I want to go over really quickly the other things I kind of looked into. I did look into the app service configuration itself. There were a ton of articles on how to do this in Windows, and not much at all about Linux. And I tried to adapt the Windows stuff for the Linux side, and it did not work. I tried using the Azure CLI, and it may have just been due to my ignorance of the Azure CLI, but that failed me as well. I did find, again, a lot of documentation on the Windows version of it, but next to none on the Linux version. As I mentioned before, I tried changing the Apache SSH files, and that didn't work either, because I had to tell it to restart the server, restart Apache, and as soon as I did, it wiped out all my changes to those Apache config files. And then there's a .deployment file that you can change your project directives for where some things will end up on the app service. And all the modifications I made there didn't seem to have any effect of that either. Some other approaches I thought of is you might be able to change your Drupal structure so that it flattens everything out, pulls it out of the doc root, and pulls it into the base directory of your repository. Another possibility is you can set up a custom Docker image on Azure for it to run, in which case you very well could just set up your full configuration, how Apache rewrites that stuff, deployment directories, all that stuff using a custom Docker image. I did not delve into it enough to figure that out for sure. Another option is to try to use Terraform, which is essentially the same as option 2, but with more complexity and the ability to save your configuration to a file. And then there were some third-party Azure images I saw in there. I tested one or two of them out, and they didn't solve the issues I was having. So I just stuck with the default image that provides. But one of those might also provide a solution for it. And I thought this was a rather good quote. First, you don't succeed, redefine success. So again, as I said before, on GitHub, I have my talk slides from both my talks and all the assets. That means all the images, any screenshots, and I'm adding README files for further details on how to do the thing, accomplish the things, and any scripts I used in the process of making these things work for my talks. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for something for us.
Thank you.
So we know.